Of the West Bank, Israel controls the land of about 40% of the West Bank, what's called Area C. So now you subtract 40% where there's no Palestinian economy, there's nothing. It's Israel, it controls the whole thing. So now you're left with 60% of the West Bank. In that 60% of the West Bank, Israel controls all the critical resources, for example, the water. Israel controls all the imports. Israel controls all the exports. The whole place is fragmented in a rat's maze of roadblocks and other impediments. Israel controls the customs duties. So, for example, this month, they collected $100 million, which they were supposed to hand over to the Palestinian Authority, because that's their money. It's Palestinian money. Israel controls it because it collects the money at the borders. And it announced today, we're not giving you the money. That was the cabinet decision this morning by Israel. It controls the taxes, it controls the critical resources, it controls what goes in, it controls what goes out. How can there be a Palestinian economy? And sometimes there are these moments where the Israelis are pretty honest about it. So about 3 days ago, when the Palestinian Authority was declaring that we're going to dissolve the Palestinian Authority, which of course was nonsense, they were never going to do it, but they were saying they were going to do it. And some Israelis, columnists in particular, one of their senior officials, senior commentators, his name is Nahum Barnea, and he writes an article and he says, well, if they dissolve it, we have a problem on our hands. He said, because there are 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and he said, and there's no economy there. No IMF nonsense, no World Bank nonsense. He was straightforward. There's no economy there. So how does it survive? It survives, as everybody knows, it survives because of US and EU subsidies, the foreign handouts from the US and the EU. That's the whole economy in the West Bank. And that's how it survives. And that's the leverage. The leverage that Kerry hopes to use is, and also the EU, the leverage is to get the Palestinians to sign on to the Israeli bottom line, to get them to sign on by threatening to withhold the money. And in fact, just as Prime Minister Abbas President Abbas for the 10,000th time threatened to dissolve the Palestinian Authority, he got a phone call from President Obama, and Obama said to him, there are going to be financial repercussions. And then Abbas said, we're not dissolving the Palestinian Authority for very practical reasons. And it's the same thing with the EU. The EU position has been a bit of an oddity. On paper, the position of the European Union has not been bad. If you look in the United Nations voting record, their statements on resolving the conflict have been perfectly consistent with international law. And I would say on paper, their position has been completely honorable. The problem is it's never been translated into anything practical because they're terrified of alienating, riling the United States. Israel, Palestine is American turf. So we're not going to do anything to upset the Americans. On the other hand, the EU has grown wary, the European countries have grown wary of this conflict. It's just, from a European point of view, it's just absurdly interminable. It just goes on and on and on and on. And the whole place is like, this side of the room is about the size of Israel, and this side of the room is about the size of Palestine. It doesn't make any sense. And so these Europeans have gotten wary of it, and they have decided, as Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton has said, the Kerry plan is the only show, the only game in town, she said. And now the EU has gotten on board to support Kerry. As they said today, it was an interesting statement, by the way. The EU hailed the agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. They issued a strong statement supporting it. But they said it's a step towards implementing the Kerry peace proposal. And the EU is weary both of the conflict, but more importantly, they're weary of paying all the bills. Because if you go into the West Bank, all the projects, all the NGOs, they're financed by the EU, by European countries. And they've grown weary of shelling out all of this money. And so now the EU is using a carrot and a stick. The stick is they're telling the Palestinian Authority, if you don't join on the Kerry plan, we're pulling out, we're pulling the plugs. And they're also telling the Israelis, they're telling the Israelis that if you don't get on the Kerry bandwagon, we're going to escalate our sanctions on the settlements in the West Bank. That's the stick, and the carrot is they're saying to both sides, there'll be real material rewards if you resolve the conflict. They're saying to the Palestinians that we'll pour in a lot of money, and they're saying to the Israelis, we'll upgrade your status in the EU if you go along with the Kerry plan. The EU is Israel's main trading partner, so it would be a significant increase, a significant reward for the Israelis if they succeeded if they resolve the conflict. There would be a significant reward for the Israelis. And that leaves the last question, which I want to look at before I end my remarks. I have the time? Yeah, okay. The last question is one which must be puzzling a lot of people in the room. The question is, if what I'm saying is true, that the Kerry mission is basically to implement Israel's core demands, then why is Israel rejecting it? Why is Israel playing a recalcitrant role? That doesn't seem to make much sense. So let me just, in the time that allows me, to briefly explain, in my opinion, what's going on. First of all, you might recall I began by saying that the U.S. has no big interest in resolving the conflict. Israel and Palestine is not on the international agenda. The Obama administration has many other things to worry about. There's no pressing urgency to resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict for the U.S. administration. The same thing is true for Israel. Israel right now is feeling no pressure at all on the Israel-Palestine front. It's been removed from the international agenda. That's number one. And number two, for those of you who've traveled to Israel, you can attest, I think, to the fact that it barely impinges any longer on Israeli life. It has no real repercussions any longer. The Israeli occupation on Israeli life. The dirty work is being done by the Palestinians, the policing work, and the so-called terrorist attacks. They're just no longer a factor in Israeli life. So there's no real pressing concern, no urgency on the part of the Israelis to negotiate a settlement. If you look at the history of the conflict, Israel has signed several agreements in the past, but they've only signed agreements with their Arab neighbors when there was a pressing need to do so. So, for example, Israel suffered a major military setback in 1973, what's sometimes called the Yom Kippur War. There were about 2,000 to 3,000 Israeli soldiers who were killed. And at least at the beginning, it seemed like a close call for the Israelis. And the feeling was on the Israeli part that we better resolve this conflict with Egypt because, we may not do all that great if and when there's a second round. The line that, in my opinion, captures the whole Israeli thinking behind the decision to negotiate a settlement with Egypt. It was caught best by the foreign minister back then, Moshe Dayan. He wrote a book on the so-called peace process. I think it was called Destination Peace. Don't quote me on that. I think it was called Destination Peace. And he had to explain, why did Israel sign this agreement? And he said, the reason is very simple, he said. A car has four wheels. If you remove one wheel from the car, it's stuck in the ground. It can't move. The Arab front had four wheels. It was Egypt, Syria, Jordan. I forgot the fourth one he included, but let's just say three for a moment. He said, if we remove the Egyptian wheel from the Arab front, they can't fight a war against us anymore. And so, after the lesson of 1973, they decided to remove the Egyptian wheel. They signed an agreement. The second major agreement the Israelis signed was in 1993, the agreement with the Palestinians. And there they also had very significant reasons for doing so. The significant reasons were, number one, as I said, this occupation after the first Intifada became a huge public relations debacle for Israel. It was the first time for people here who go back, the first main disaster, public relations disaster for Israel was the 1982 Lebanon War. But the 1987 Palestinian Intifada, it really reached into the mainstream of American life, and it caused huge problems for Israel. And then the prime minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, he was very honest. If people go back and look at the record, he said, what we have to do is we have to get Palestinians to do the dirty work so we won't have problems with all these liberal human rights organizations like ACRI, the civil rights in Israel. What does ACRI stand for? ACR, for Civil Rights in Israel. Association for Civil Rights in Israel. ACRI, B'Tselem. He says we'll get all these liberal organizations off our back because they accuse us, rightfully, of course, of committing massive amounts of indiscriminate torture. So we'll get the Palestinians to do all the torture, and we'll be out of the picture. So the first thing was that Israel wanted to clean up its Public Relations Act, that Palestinians torture Palestinians, and then we won't have a problem. And by the way, I don't have time to go into it, but the problem of torture was a very big one for Israel. And it came out in the first Intifada. Israel had been torturing Palestinian detainees since 1967, and it's freely acknowledged now. If you read, for example, Benny Morris's Righteous Victims or Tom Segev's 1967, they just say in passing without any big to do about it. Israelis were torturing Palestinian detainees since 1967. What changed was in 1987 with the first Intifada, it became massive because they had a huge civil revolt on their hands. And the torture of Palestinians, to use the human rights organization language, it was methodical, systematic, and routine. Israel was methodically, routinely, and systematically torturing Palestinian civilians, detainees. The number was huge. Human Rights Watch estimated between 20 and 30,000 Palestinian detainees had been tortured between 1987 and I think maybe 1993, but maybe less, maybe 1990. And the other important fact was it was now Israeli human rights organizations which were documenting it. So Israel had a very hard time denying it. The first major report came out not from Amnesty International, not from Human Rights Watch. It came out in 1990 from B'Tselem. And so Israel really had an impossible time trying to deny it. You know, some creeps like Alan Dershowitz attempted to, but it really wasn't very successful when it was perfectly obvious what was going on, and it was undeniable. So that was the first major reason Israel signed that 1993 agreement with the Palestinians. And the second major reason was it was a civil revolt. And Israel has a civilian army, and Israel is a small place, which meant if you went into the occupied territories, then anybody there who was there during the first Intifada, I'm just curious. I spent a lot of time there during those years. If you went there, you saw 65-year-old Israelis in fatigues. They had to bring up their whole reserve army. There were 500,000 Israelis at one time in the occupied territories at that moment. Yeah, it was a huge civilian revolt. And the Israelis began to worry. If our soldiers are busy chasing little kids down alleyways who are throwing stones, then they won't have time to train for war. And that's what the army is supposed to do. It's supposed to be training people to fight real wars, not what was called policing actions. And so the second reason they signed the Oslo Agreement was to get the army out of that situation so it can do what it's supposed to do, fight real wars, kill Syrians and Egyptians and all that sort of stuff. So in those two cases, Israel had real motives. Right now, as I said, there's no urgency on the part of Israel to resolve the conflict. It's more or less a weighing the pros and the cons. And there are some significant pros for Israel. As I said, if it ends the conflict now, if Netanyahu signs, first of all, he gets 10% of the West Bank. He gets annulment of the right of return. He gets an upgrading of status in the EU. He will get probably better relations with the United States. There are incentives, but the incentives they aren't seen as significant enough that Netanyahu is ready to sign an agreement. And let me just end with what the Israeli position is right now. The Israeli position, as everyone I suppose in this room knows, is they've incorporated two new demands. There were the core demands, which I mentioned. Up until now, that was the Israeli position. And now they have incorporated two new demands. The two new demands are, they say they want to keep parts of the Jordan Valley, and they want Israel to be recognized as a Jewish state. The Jordan Valley, retention of Jordan Valley shouldn't detain us because it's actually just a meaningless demand. Israelis and their supporters have freely acknowledged that the Jordan Valley has exactly zero strategic value to Israel. Shlomo Ben Ami, Israel's former foreign minister, if you open up his book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, he refers to the mythical, that's his words, the mythical strategic value of the Jordan Valley. Even Dennis Ross, who's just a hack, if you look at his book, The Missing Piece, even he says there doesn't really seem to be much of an argument that the Jordan Valley has any strategic value. And also senior Israeli officials have said the same thing. Exactly why Israel wants to keep the Jordan Valley, or Netanyahu says he wants to keep the Jordan Valley, that's a matter of speculation. I can give you my own opinion, but we'll leave that for later. The last issue is the question of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. And the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, just as a matter of history and reason, it just doesn't make any sense. It can't be a real issue. Israel signed peace agreements, as I said, with Egypt in the Camp David Accord in 1978, the Israel-Egypt Agreement of 1979. The Egyptians weren't asked as part of the agreement to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It never even came up in the negotiations. If you look at the record of the negotiations, the prime minister at the time was Menachem Begin. He argued very forcefully to keep the oil wells in the Egyptian Sinai, to keep the settlements in the Egyptian Sinai, to keep the airfields in the Egyptian Sinai, but recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Now remember, at that time, Menachem Begin was considered the far right. He never raised the issue. He's the same party as Netanyahu, the Likud. It never came up. The next agreement, 1993, the Oslo Agreement. What's called Oslo I of 1991. Okay, you could say it's a very broad agreement. It runs to maybe 2 pages, and so maybe they forgot about it then. Okay, the argument is not really tenable, but for argument's sake, let's accept it. Oslo II, the agreement that was signed in September 1995. Oslo II is 314 folio-sized pages. It goes through every aspect, every facet of the Israeli occupation, every period, every comma, every semicolon, every colon has been vetted by those Israeli lawyers. Everything. They have 4 pages just on the question of Palestinian VIPs. VIPs 1, VIPs 2, VIPs 3, and then there's a 4th category. It looks at everything. Recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, it never came up. It was never an issue. 1994, Israel enters into a peace treaty with Jordan. Recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, it never comes up. 2006, President Bush, who can hardly be accused of being anti-Israel, Bush releases the roadmap to peace. There's no 2006, there's no mention of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. It was a roadmap which says, Israel has to do this, simultaneously Palestinians have to do that. Israelis have to do this, simultaneously Palestinians have to do that. It goes step by step by step by step by step by step. Nothing about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. It never comes up. That's the historical record. Now, what does reason tell you? How can Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state if no two Israelis agree on who is a Jew, let alone what is a Jewish state? How can you recognize Israel as a Jewish state if nobody knows what it means to call Israel a Jewish state? When Israel's Chief Justice, Aharon Barak, was asked the question, they put to him a question squarely. They said, in your founding documents, your Declaration of Independence, you call Israel a Jewish state and you call Israel a democratic state. How do you reconcile those two principles? And he was very honest and he said, we haven't figured that out. So if they don't know what it is to call Israel a Jewish state, how can you expect Palestinians to recognize something, the content of which nobody, by admission, understands what it means? But there's another question. The question is, if Israel were serious about wanting to be recognized as a Jewish state, there's a very easy way to do it. And it's not facetious what I'm suggesting. In 1979, after the revolution in Iran, the new government in Iran wanted Iran to be recognized as an Islamic state. So what was the first thing they did? Within 4 months of the revolution, they changed their name to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so now anyone who recognized Iran was ipso facto recognizing the Islamic Republic of Iran, because that's their name. All Israel has to do, if it wants to be recognized as a Jewish state, it's very simple. All they have to do is change their name to the Jewish state of Israel. It's not complicated. It's not unprecedented. They simply have to do what the mullahs did. Change their name to the Jewish state of Israel. Now, it's an interesting question. I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, why the hell don't they do that? And the answer is actually quite revealing. Because in significant ways, Israel is a democratic society. And it knows full well that if it changed its name to the Jewish state of Israel, the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish would be outraged and would express their outrage at its redesignation. And so now you have the paradox that Israel wants Palestinians to do what Israel itself won't do. They want Palestinians to recognize themselves as a Jewish state, but they themselves won't recognize themselves as a Jewish state. So where does that leave us? In my opinion, and that's where I'm going to end off, in my opinion, the reason Netanyahu is making this demand is not because he takes it seriously. He figures that in order to get the Kerry plan approved by his coalition, and his coalition consists largely of crazies, lunatic people, but that's his coalition, and that's where he feels most comfortable. That's home for Netanyahu. He figures if he can extract that concession from the Palestinians, recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, it would be a huge ideological victory for the components of his coalition. Because for that coalition, what constitutes a victory, an ideological victory, is how much you can humiliate the Palestinians. That's for them. Victory is humiliating Palestinians. If they can extract that concession from the Palestinians, recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, it will be a huge humiliation, which in his mind, he figures if he can extract that concession, then he probably can get them to go along with the rest of the Kerry plan. So I don't agree with the people who say that he's just trying to sabotage the negotiations by bringing in that demand. I think he's using that demand because from a political point of view, if he can achieve it, it would be a way to get support from his coalition for the Kerry plan. So that's the picture as I see it. And now I'll be very happy to hear your questions, comments, not just bearing on the topic of my talk this evening, but on any other concerns you might have. Thank you.
If you can ask a question, please use the microphone because this is being recorded and the standard rules apply. A question, maybe a brief comment, but not a speech. The floor is open.
The easiest thing is just to line up because for the sake of the video, they need you to speak there.
Norman, I've just finished reading Blumenthal's book, Goliath, and it paints a picture of internal rot that is serious and ongoing. And I was most struck by the fact that there's a vigorous Israeli community growing apace of disaffected Israelis who now live in Berlin. Would you like to comment on that turn of events?
Let me just speak broadly on the issue. I can't speak with any kind of authority on the emigration. I think the figures I had read, now I could be wrong in that there are 200,000 Israelis now in Germany. It may be as high as that. That's an interesting, it's an interesting issue, obviously, that Germany has now become a haven for sane Israelis. But I'm going to leave aside that. There's no question in my mind that Israel has large components of Israel's society have gone crazy. It's become, as I've said, and I probably have been quoted too much on that particular statement, it's become a lunatic state. I'm a little bit, let's say, I don't want to say I'm skeptical. I have a problem with depicting Israel as having reached a point where sort of there's no alternative but to get rid of it. I don't really belong to that school of thought. So let me just backtrack a little. Number one, it's often said that Israel was born in original sin, which is true. It was born in the expulsion of the indigenous population. And to deny that, I think, is just to deny fairly uncontroversial facts. There were people there, and the people were kicked out of their homes. But does that mean that Israel can't change? Everybody in this room knows the United States was born in twice the original sin, because our original sin was actually triple, because it consisted of extermination, expulsion, and enslavement. Enslavement of the African population and the extermination and expulsion of the native population. And it was an original sin. We've had to live with it, and we should have to live with it, of course, up until the present. But does that mean that the United States is unreformable, unchangeable? Do the people who came here and committed those sins and their descendants, do they have to pack up and leave? No, I'm not really of that school of thought. I don't think there's any state in the world that wasn't born in original sin. So I don't think that using that standard to delegitimize Israel is a fair standard. You should recognize the sin for sure, just as we as Americans should recognize the sins that attended the creation of the United States, but it doesn't follow from that a country can't reform, is incapable of reform, and hopefully, I think, changing for the better. In the case of South African society during the 1980s, that society was completely crazy. There was the far right there was not unlike the far right now in Israel. And they were as dug in as the Israelis are now. And they had the same attitude of the whole world is against us. and they had the same way they dealt with the problem. They would say, why is everybody focusing on South Africa? It's so much worse in other African countries. There's less democracy. People are poorer in the other African countries. And what about Eastern Europe? And what about communism? And blah, 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 blah. They used the same sorts of arguments, and they had the same levels of fanaticism as the Israelis. But that, to me, again, doesn't mean that South Africa it's still in a very primitive stage, but wasn't able to reform. And so I have a little problem with these kinds of depictions of Israel, such that, yes, it's filled with all sorts of craziness, all sorts of fanaticism. It was born in original sin. All those statements are true. But it doesn't follow, in my opinion, from those facts, that therefore Israel becomes a quote-unquote illegitimate state, illegal state. Israel has to be dismantled. Israel has to disappear, and all that sort of stuff. I don't see the logic of it. I don't accept it. I don't see any basis for it, and so frankly, I reject it. I can accept the bill of. I can accept the indictment. Well, I'll accept the indictment with two caveats. Number one. Don't forget about your own country and its record before you go indicting Israel. And number two, I don't accept the political conclusion that follows from the indictment. Countries can be guilty of the worst sorts of sins, the worst sorts of crimes, and they can change. Just to give you one example, which strikes me very much, I'm not going to make any apologies for other imperialist countries because the record of Western imperialism in the 19th and 20th century is horrible. That's just a fact. But I think it's fair to say, and I don't say with any kind of disparagement towards anyone, that the most racist and militarist countries in the first part of the 20th century, the most racist and the most militarist, were Germany and Japan. The records are terrible. I mean, it's often forgotten the Japanese killed about 26 million Chinese during World War II. It was a ghastly state. But here's the irony. Some of you might look occasionally at the BBC World Service polls. Every year, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, it does a survey. It asks people from 36 countries around the world. It asks, which country do you think has had the most positive impact on the world? Which countries do you think have had the most negative impact on the world? The negative every year is the same. 4 countries at the bottom, it's always Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. Every single year, they're always at the bottom. You know what the 2 countries at the top every year are? It's a very interesting fact. The most positive impact on the world is Germany and Japan. Now, countries can change. And we should, I think, be sensitive to that fact. As I said, I am the last person on God's earth to in any way want to diminish the magnitude of the indictment against Israel, since I spent a good part of my entire adult life documenting it and reading through tens of thousands of pages of human rights reports to get every period and comma right. And frankly, it's the thing that kept me going for most of my adult life. Whenever I thought, all right, I'm tired of this. I can't take it anymore. This is just not the way I expected to spend my life. I would read another human rights report on what's going on there, and it just ripped me up inside. This was just wrong. And it was wrong in the most brutal sorts of ways. It was just, a person builds a house for his family. The Israelis demolish it. He builds it again, they demolish it. He builds it a 3rd time, they demolish it. He built it a 4th time, they demolish it. This is just crazy. So I'm not going to in any way diminish what Israel has done, but I think there's a certain segment, let's call it that, a certain segment of the solidarity movement that draws conclusions from these facts, which I find unacceptable, both because I think they're hypocritical and also because I don't think the conclusions follow from the facts. You can say the worst things about Israel, but it doesn't follow from that fact that Israel has to disappear.
Well,